I'd like to call upon Jeannie from PSEC to introduce the moderator of our next panel, the Regulatory Blockbuster. Jeannie Piercy.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jeannie Piercy, as you mentioned. I'm one of the owners of PSEC, which is a structural engineering and inspection firm for towers. PSEC was one of the early members to join STAC in 2016, as we recognized the importance of being engaged in the future of our industry. Our management team is very active in the various STAC committees, and I myself am honored to be the chair of the newly formed Women of STAC committee that has a mandate of attracting more women to the telecom industry and providing opportunities for mentorship and career advancement. On behalf of CWTA, the presenting sponsor, it is my privilege to introduce the moderator for the Regulatory Blockbuster session. Greg O'Brien has been a journalist for more than 25 years, with the last 20 having been spent exclusively covering the Canadian cable, radio, television, and telecom sectors. Since its launch in May of 2005, CARTT.ca has become the industry's news leader, the place where thousands of professionals turn for the breaking news, in-depth feature stories, analysis, and opinions about the industry in Canada, the US, and around the world. Please join me in welcoming Greg O'Brien and the rest of the panel for this session.
Thanks. Thanks, Jeannie, for that very kind introduction. I get way more of a bio than you guys are going to get in about a minute. And thanks to the organizers for inviting me again to do this. This panel is often fun, always a little prickly, which is part of the fun. So we'll get right to it. And I've said this before, but I kind of wish the CRTC would run panels like this, you know, to decide policy with everyone facing off. No? Everyone wouldn't like that? Anyone? I would. Anyway, I would. So anyway, our panel today, from left to right, is CJ Prudham, who's Chief Legal Officer at Xplornet. Next to her is David Watt, Senior Vice President of Regulatory at Rogers. Beside him is Andy Kaplan-Myrth, Vice President, Regulatory and Carrier Affairs at TekSavvy. Then we have Ted Woodhead, Senior Vice President and Strategic Policy Advisor at TELUS. Beside him is Samar Bishay, CEO of Iristel and Ice Wireless. And at the end is Rob Malcolmson, Senior Vice President, Regulatory Affairs and Government Relations at Bell Canada. So I wanted to say at this point too, if you have any questions, we're not really going to wait to the end to have a question and answer session. Just get up, go to a mic, and we'll find you and ask your question whenever you feel the urge to say something or to ask the panelists something. So now we'll move on to the standard opening moderator cliche portion of the event, where I say the industry is being transformed from all sides. Where have you heard that before, right? But it's true. It's being changed from within, from without, and crucially from Ottawa. We stand on the edge right now of major legal and regulatory decisions. We have the Broadcast and Telecom Legislative Review Panel, BTLR, or what I and some others have taken to calling Butler, the Butler panel, where Chair Janet Yale said yesterday she warned companies she wanted them to think really long-term and to think really big about what they have to say. There's a proposed new directive to the CRTC coming. I had hoped to hear some more of that from Minister Baines yesterday, or tomorrow, I should say, but I guess he's going to be sticking strictly to the 3,500 megahertz auction rules and maybe a few other things. And those few other things may render a lot of what we have to say today up on the panel here moot, but we'll see. We'll see. We've also got a CRTC wireless review where the rather activist federal government on this file has kicked the commission in the pants to get going on this wireless review and set a direction where we're probably going to see mandated wireless resellers, or MVNOs, which we're going to talk about up here. And we have a CRTC chair who said yesterday he wants all of the carriers in the room to start treating their customers better. But at the heart of it all, the Prime Minister, Minister Baines, and Canadians, they want lower prices, period. Seems to be what they want, to me anyway. So that could mean the long-standing federal government policy bedrock of facilities-based competition, which has long been considered the best way to provide that competition and innovation and jobs and excellent connectivity far and wide, might be history, might be changed to services-based. So all of that said, I'm going to now turn to Ted, Dave, and Rob first and ask, why don't you just nip all this in the bud and just let these MVNOs on your network for a reasonable low wholesale fee?
Well, I mean, it's not that we don't want to let them on our network. We want them to negotiate a commercial rate for it. I mean, that's not unheard of. In fact, that is the way that the small number of MVNOs that exist in the world today have done that. That's how US MVNOs did it with Sprint and T-Mobile. In some cases, as part of 4-to-3 mergers, for example, Ireland and some other jurisdictions, there have been, as a competition remedy, MVNOs required, although my understanding is that in most of those cases, they have not been terribly successful. So from our perspective, the fundamental question is really, does Canada want to be an extreme outlier and mandate in the way that seems to be proposed for the large three carriers that MVNO and regulate some regulated access? It's not that, that to me is the existential question, and as policymakers where both the CRTC and the government need to give hard thought is to kind of the history of how this has played out in Canada. And let's go back. I mean, we can see what incoherent policies do. In 2008, after much machinations, the government managed to put its thumb on the scale, create competitors, all of which became insolvent, the destruction of capital, all of which were later bought up by incumbent telcos and cable wireless operators. And those new entrants that emerged out of that, Shaw, Videotron, and Eastlink being the ones that had invested early on, they have actually delivered on the facilities-based promise. They are actually actively out there trying to deploy networks and expand their network coverage. And to me, quite frankly, the government's policy now is equally incoherent. These people come along and rescue your fourth carrier policy, and before they even have their legs under them, you're trying to cut them down. Like, that's incoherent. And this policy, proposed policy of MVNOs, is equally incoherent. It's a failed 1990s policy from Europe that even Europe is backing away from. And here we are in 2019, and it's like it's a new day again. That is the problem.
But is the problem the wholesale rate that you're asking from the MVNOs who have approached you? Because there are some in Canada, they're not very big. But what's to be done to satisfy the government's preoccupation with launching MVNOs in Canada?
Let me put it to you this way. If you want actually an MVNO to arise in a commercially viable way, the way you don't do that is for the government to come in and muse about regulating MVNO access. That's counterintuitive. Of course they're not. Like, if I'm somebody out there that wants to start an MVNO, I'm going to shake the dice in this environment and go for it and hope that for the best. What will happen at the end of the day, regardless of what that rate is, and I speak from an experience of now, I guess, 27 years in this industry, is there will be some moment of joy in the land, and then it will be an endless series of too expensive, not fast enough, terms and conditions are onerous, et cetera, et cetera. We have seen that time and time again in LD. We saw it in local. All of those competitors have largely disappeared, and you'll see it again here, and it's incoherent.
So Dave, I think you wanted to jump on something, and then I'd like to turn to CJ to ask about your facilities based in small, and then we'll get to Samer and Andy, who I know would want in on the MVNO space.
Sure. Well, Ted, you're a bit of a young pup at 27 years in the industry. To your point, though, Greg, you say, can there be a rate? You said a low rate that then would solve the problem. I think implicit in that statement is that there is a large margin being earned by the existing companies. Prices really are a function of two things, the actual cost of providing the service and then the return. And we've heard a lot today about the quality of Canada's network from the Open Signal fellow this morning in terms of the speed, et cetera. Also spoke about the challenging terrain in Canada. The fact is we pay the highest spectrum fees in the world, both at auction and in annual spectrum fees that also go into the cost. We have a very low population density. All that being said, we've built a high-quality network in what can be viewed as a high-cost environment. So there's a reason for the costs being what they are. Maybe it would have been better if we built a poorer quality network. Prices could have been lower, but we don't think that's really what Canadians want. The other factor we should consider when we're thinking about the price level is that we have a handset subsidy model here in Canada. We heavily subsidize foreign currency denominated handsets, recover those costs over time in Canadian dollars. So sort of set the stage on costs. Now, even people who are skeptical of what I've said about the costs there, really probably think there's some aspect of validity there. I think these people, when they think of price, really focus on the aspect of the carrier's profits. And there, I think we simply make too much money. I would suggest otherwise. Looking at Rogers' numbers last year, Rogers made 6.6% return on its net investments. Yes, we have large net income, $2 billion, but we have $30 billion invested in our network. And that's the depreciated value. So that's actual dollars. I would compare that 6.6%. You can get a GIC with no risk, sure by the government as well, at 3%. Now, actually 2.9. And compare that as well to the Canadian pension plan. Last year, it earned, I think it was 8.9%. And over the last 10 years has returned 11.1% on its investment. So I think there's a myth that is pretty prevalent that there are large profits that could be shaved off in order to provide an arbitrage opportunity, enhance.
Well, yeah, I mean, I and others look at, Rogers, Bell, TELUS's quarterly numbers, and we see your margins on wireless sales, for example, and those are pretty healthy. So is there room in there? Rob, let's bring you in.
No, I think you're missing the point, though. You're looking at the operating margin. The point is, that goes into the network, and the bottom line is 6.6% return on that investment. That's not supernormal profits.
Rob, did you want to add?
Well, when I listened to your opening monologue, it sort of crystallized for me everything we're seeing going on. And Ted uses the word incoherent. I would use the word confused. When I look at government policy, what the CRTC is doing, and how the wireless marketplace is functioning today, I wonder why all of a sudden MVNOs are the answer. We've got 33 million wireless subs in this country. We've got ubiquitous coverage. We've got world-leading networks. We, unlike other countries, actually have facilities-based entrants in a country our size, being Shaw, Videotron, and Eastlink, who are making real inroads into the marketplace, and they're doing it by investing. So we seem to have the best of all worlds in the sense that a highly competitive market, prices coming down. You heard Robert Giz talk about a 54% drop under StatsCan data from 2014 till now. Those prices will continue to come down. We're hearing that the system added 1.5 million wireless subscribers, and I think Freedom and Videotron, setting aside Eastlink, added almost 30% of those. So the market is working. The market is highly competitive, and someone somewhere has decided we need a resale model. And then at the same time, we have a government that is quite properly focused on rural deployment, rural coverage, extending wireless into rural areas. Those two policies are in complete conflict with one another. So I think confusion is the word of the day. Okay. CJ's company is investing in spectrum, investing in rural areas. Why not give everyone a chance? The competitive model under a facilities-based model is working.
I know Andy and Sam are champing at the bit. They want in here, but I just wanted to ask CJ. So this change would seem on the face of it would be hard for the smaller facilities-based sellers like yourself, like Videotron, like Eastlink, as Rob was saying. But would it? Does this change make you afraid, or do you look at it and say, we could really stop building our network and be an MVNO everywhere else?
Well, I think we always start with a question of what's the problem we're trying to solve. And it seems I would agree with the gentleman prescribing an answer, which is MVNO, when we haven't really decided what the issue is and what the best way to approach it is. Xplornet has, much like the other companies, certainly not as much money, but has invested over $1.5 billion in our network. We are clearly a facilities-based provider. Are there barriers to entry? There are absolutely barriers to entry into this business, and the large capital expenditures are certainly one of them. But I wouldn't suggest that money alone is the only barrier, and therefore we should immediately jump to an MVNO solution. There are some elements of an MVNO that will overcome some of those barriers. There are other ways to approach it. For example, we've suggested that maybe seamless roaming is a different way of going at it to reduce it, so that you're not building the fifth set of infrastructure in downtown Toronto, as an example, which is an unduly expensive thing to do and, quite frankly, doesn't add to the general infrastructure across Canada, when that money could be better spent, for example, serving areas that are not as well served right now.
Can you explain to me seamless roaming, just so I have it straight?
Well, currently there isn't a requirement for a seamless handoff, so when you're going from one network to the other network, the call will drop.
Right, okay.
That's obviously something that consumers don't like. It's definitely a very consumer-unfriendly approach and represents a barrier for a new entrant, because you have to build a very large area in order to ensure your customers aren't dropping.
Right.
As opposed to being able to invest in areas where it might be appropriate and allow them to seamlessly roam into, like I said, downtown Toronto as an example.
Okay, cool. Okay, so Samer and Andy, let's turn to you guys now and explain to us why you want a free ride on all these guys' networks here. I know.
Before I answer that question, I think the issue is not about MVNO. It's not about, we must have a fourth carrier. I think the problem at hand is we are not solving or tackling the root cause of this issue. And the root cause is we need to attain a free market economy. How do we get from here to that free market economy so that we can let things thrive on their own? The way things are set up from a regulatory framework, a legislative perspective, it's not conducive for that. And in order to address the issue so that, it's already an uphill battle trying to build or becoming an MVNO is actually much harder than becoming an MNO, because you have no control over the network, you have no control over pricing. It's all commercial agreements, typically in a free market economy. And you're spending tons of money trying to convince a consumer to switch over to you when you own pretty much nothing except the back end, which, if you're a facilities-based MVNO or non-facilities, depending which type of MVNO you are. But at the end of the day, it's already an uphill battle. So not mandating MVNO in the landscape that we are in here in Canada is almost like letting Bell or any of the incumbents do whatever they want. And we've seen what could happen if things go deregulated. As a matter of fact, I mean, look what happened to Iristel. Look on thanks to actually PIAC on that, the submission about George Cope's shareholder call about wholesale. They made it very clear that they're not interested in wholesale. They want nothing to do with wholesale, and if it wasn't for the regulatory requirement, they would be dropping wholesale. So we got hit with a 250% rate increase on a business, so we built our business case based on a specific price model, and then overnight it changes. So the issue is not about MVNO. Like, I think we're trying to tackle the branch, not the root sort of thing, and it's much more intricate than that, and really we need a radical change in terms of legislative framework and you know, just an overhaul. That's what we need.
Well, I find your definition of a free market economy fascinating. So your definition, I guess, is you invest nothing in spectrum, you free ride on other networks, and you engage in price arbitrage, and somehow that's a free market economy.
Not at all.
I don't think so.
Not at all. We've invested in spectrum. We actually just won blocks in the 600 megahertz. We've built a network. We're the only CLEC in the country that has facilities in each and every province. As a matter of fact, talk about confusion. I'm also confused because facilities in the definition from ISET's perspective, it says any forms of communications, intelligent communications, receive, transmit using any electromagnetic or cable. Yet on the CRTC side, they've defined, or they carved out the wireless aspect, saying that in order to be facilities or a home network, you have to have a tower or a radio access network sitting on a pole. As far as I'm concerned, from one definition, Iristel has built facilities, the only one that has built facilities in the entire country, so we qualify. And we've invested in spectrum, so no, I'm not asking for a free ride. I want a free market economy.
But the MVNO model is a free ride model.
Not at all. If I get spectrum, and I do have spectrum now, I am opening MVNO. So whether the incumbents like it or not, MVNO is going to happen. And as a matter of fact, we've been building our entire network based on becoming an MVNE. There's nothing wrong with letting others. As a matter of fact, that's our whole business model at Iristel. So I'm not sure, like I'm confused as well because the definitions are not clear in terms of, okay, what defines facilities? And I think if we go back to the basis and say, okay, facilities based, well, what does that really mean? Is it really just that RAN? And actually, I think it was Rogers earlier on one of the panels said, the RAN component is not even 20% of that network. It means nothing. What about all the facilities we set up on the back end? The HSSs, the HLRs, the APCs, the negotiations, the call centers, the people that man the call centers, having proper customer service, that's facilities.
Andy, I'd like you to sort of expand on that and also maybe address the full MVNO to explain your position with the...
Yeah, I mean, MVNO can mean a range of things to different people. What we've been promoting is a full MVNO model, which means that we would have more control over the network. We would actually use as much of our own network as we could, and interconnect essentially as far out as possible. I don't know if that means interconnecting at the RAN at the towers or on some local. Local serving area kind of thing, but we would, in our model, build as much of the facilities as we would be able to, and that way we would control that part of the network. This is a continuing theme. It's very similar to what we've wanted on the wireline side, which is more control over the network, where it makes sense, where it's efficient to build our own facilities. It's not efficient to build your own access network and connect to every home. It's not efficient for us all to be buying spectrum in order to reach the end users. So it's very similar themes there. In terms of the kind of reconfiguration that needs to happen here, we've inherited on the mobile side the historical sort of incumbency model that we had on the telco side, because it all developed out of the same thing. And what that's resulted in is this assumption that we should have a small number of large players who are best positioned to provide those end user services. When Sam, not to put words in Sam's mouth, but talking about open market economy up for competition, I think we are talking about service-based competition, creating the kind of environment where different providers can compete with each other openly to provide services to end users. The incumbency model might support that on the facilities side, but on the service side, we shouldn't be limited to only the privileged incumbents who came up or took over services in regions to be able to also provide the services to end users.
So, but where should we end up? I mean, there's all sorts of different levels. Cogeco has proposed something different than the full MVNO. The .mobile folks are here. There's even a lighter service than is offered. And then we've got facilities-based, and nobody wants 5, 6, 7 facilities perched on buildings all around the country. Right. So, I'm struggling to find out, maybe it is incoherent. As Ted said, or maybe we do have to really start over, as Samer said.
Well, this is going to, there's a lot of details that are going to take a long time to resolve, and I don't know exactly where it's going to land. But we think that if you mandated a full MVNO model, then that would create an environment where other models would evolve. I don't think it's realistic right now to negotiate for anything other than a pure resale model. I don't think anybody could actually negotiate with any of these incumbents to provide the kind of full MVNO model that we envision. And that would create the kind of service level competition. I mean, we can talk after the panel if you want, but I don't think that that's actually realistic. I do think that if it were mandated to provide that full MVNO, then there'd be a possibility of actually negotiating for a range of different models, and players would emerge that offered services in all different ways along that spectrum. And it would take years to evolve, no doubt, and we would see what consumers actually wanted and what was sustainable. But it would evolve in a way that would be less prescriptive than us sitting here right now and saying this is the only model that works, especially one that sustains the kind of incumbency privilege that we happen to have right now.
Let's be clear, and starting left to right, there is no credible evidence of a market failure here. People can say that, but there is no credible evidence of a market failure. Then Andy, he thinks the real answer here is the full MVNO. That happens to be the MVNO that his company wants to engage in, potentially. I've heard about terms and conditions. I've heard about, I don't know whether I want to interconnect at the local level or I want to interconnect at the RAN. These are the kind of endless wheeling regulatory issues that are frankly exhausting and useless to engage in. These are the very people who wanted aggregated access to DSL. Then they didn't want aggregated access to DSL. They wanted disaggregated access. This is, again, the kind of wheeling incoherence that is bad for the industry. And at the base of every one of these proposals that you're going to hear, it is the networks of people who actually build networks. If you want 5G in this country, it's not being built over here. It's being built by facilities-based providers.
I hope you're not including us
no,
in that.
I'm actually looking at you, CJ, because I should have mentioned, the government in an acquisition used Xplornet as a remedy partner in Manitoba. So in the process of getting off the ground, where they just said, you're an appropriate remedy partner in the province of Nova Scotia, where you have significant spectral assets deployed to provide fixed wireless access, I believe, in rural and other areas of the country. You're putting your thumb on the scale, you're disadvantaging a facilities-based player who has a history of building facilities.
So if I could just add, so let's assume that we all agree with the facilities-based concept, all right? I'll still prove that the system is backlogged because the rules are antiquated. And the reason is, let's look at facilities-based providers in the country and the struggles they go through. Cloud Wi-Fi, perfect example. We were involved with them because we're the CLEC behind the, I guess the layer 1 or class 1 CLEC, type 1 CLEC versus their type 3 CLEC. And they're a facilities-based provider. Until today, it's what, almost a year, maybe 10 months, and they still haven't gotten a decision to get them to get fiber or access to that dry loop or copper loop in the building so they can deploy service. That's a facilities-based provider, which means that the CRTC is not able to cope with the volume of work. So back to my point, facilities are not facilities, MVNO or no MVNO. It's not the point. The point is we need to start from a clean sheet of rules so that we can start applying 5G technologies, which is about convergence, not divergence. It's about convergence. It's about uniting Wi-Fi with LTE, with satellite, all together to connect that end customer. So it's broken. The system, we need fixing. So I'll be on your side for a minute. I'll say, okay, facilities-based, but it's not working because we built facilities in the north. We got accused of traffic stimulation. Honestly speaking,
That's because you were selling retail services in the south.
It has nothing to do with that.
You're a wireless provider.
You want to build facilities,
in the north.
Facilities. Well, come build facilities in the north, but don't fight. It's always the ILEC fighting the system, or gaming the system, I should say.
You're the one gaming the system.
Great. So the
permanent
point is,
roaming. Nobody ever told you that permanent roaming not allowed?
Well, as far as the definition goes with I'm a facilities-based carrier, then you know what? It should technically be allowed.
So really you're just arbitraging the regulatory system or what your definition of
And that's why it's taken 4
is.
years and we're still where we are today. We're still debating that cost. If it was black and white like you say, a decision would have been rendered.
It is black and white. You're wrong. Now, why there's no decision is, it's one of the great mysteries of life. But
The permanent roaming is a great example because I think intuitively to consumers, roaming seems like a vehicle that's already in place for why I would be able to get a phone from one place and use it in other places, or a number in one place and use it in others. It's a system that's already in place that you could leverage to, effectively create some kind of virtual operator model. Yes, the CRTC has said no to permanent roaming, but to Ted's point about we could do this right now, anybody here could. If you wanted to negotiate to allow SAMR to do permanent roaming, you could do that. Anyone could do that.
Well, then I would be turning my back on a facilities-based model.
No, you would be sustaining a facilities-based model at a lower layer and allowing a service-based layer of competition to evolve on top of that.
Okay, so let's, it's your panel. There's a reason, folks, seriously. There is a reason we have high-quality services. There's a reason 92% of Canadians have access to LTE Advanced. There's a reason that 98% of Canadians have access to fixed broadband services. There's a reason that happens, and that's because of the facilities-based model. You can argue about, you disagree with it.
No, I don't take issue with the investments that you build and that you put into facilities. You invest in facilities, you build good networks. You build such good networks that we want our customers to have access to those networks too. It's the same on the wireline side. We've paid $500 million to incumbents over the past 5 years. That supports those investments. It's a small part of supporting those investments, but it is our share of that market. Nobody has an issue with that. What we're talking about is how to create the competition on top of those facilities that you're investing in.
Well,
we don't think that we need to give you a
respond
monopoly
to you
on the service layer on top of
There's a lot in that salad, but we spend $3 billion a year like clockwork on building networks. Bell spends, God knows what, some big number. Rogers spends another big number. CJ's company spends a big number. Shaw spends a big number. Videotron spends a big number. Lots of people spend
yeah,
a big
everybody
number.
spends big
and
numbers
the
on
question
phone networks.
is, if you want 5G, if you want ubiquitous networks at a high quality, facilities-based is the way to go.
But that's hypocrisy, because you can't go 5G and expect that you're going to mount 10 different antennas on one light pole. The city's going to look hideous.
I mean, I
Well,
heard,
how
I
could that
heard,
even
I
go?
heard Greg make that comment, but thanks for reminding me. Look, I've been around long enough when, you know, fixed wired telecom was considered a natural monopoly. Well, that's been proven wrong. Cable was never even considered as part of the game plan in any of the telecom stuff. Sorry, not true there either. You know, oh, there's going to be this multiplicity of, the new thing now is there's going to be 18 towers on every pole. Well, realistically, no, because the market won't sustain 18 providers. Sorry to tell you that. And I don't see that as a problem. This is the kind of usual boogeyman that people throw up when they want to really, you know, just justify their own opportunistic position. But the fact of the matter is that facilities-based competition as a first principle is the only way to deliver the very things, and when you talk about incoherence of policy, in the innovation and skills plan. If you want networks, if you want innovation, that's where the on-top people can provide the innovation. You need facilities-based competition at its core. And that, to me, is factually supported by the evidence and data that we have in this country over
But Ted,
30
I'm sitting
years
on
of
both
competition.
Sides of the coin. I'm the only one on this panel that's sitting on both sides of the coin, facilities and MVNO. So I've seen it on both sides. And yes, okay, MVNOs do reduce our margins slightly.
I don't actually understand that, though. So you're a CLEC in some exchange, in some POPs. Is that what you are on that side of it? Is that your facilities? Plus your wireless operation in the north?
Not just the north. So we have wireless operations. We just won Spectrum in Newfoundland, Labrador. We
Okay,
got
that's
Northeast
the
Quebec.
600.
Northeast Quebec.
Okay,
we
fair.
operate there.
Fair.
Operate in the north. We got towers. So I sit on both sides of it, and I can tell you, I'm for facilities based, but we got to define what facilities are, and it's not the radio on the light pole. That's not what it is. So I am for facilities based, but it has to be defined, and it has to be in a way that allows free market economy once again. That's all I'm saying.
To suggest that Canada isn't a free market economy
It's not. In telecom, it's not.
It's laughable.
Well,
We have an open entry policy. You know exactly how to do it, and you can do it.
Yeah, so Dave,
Just
go ahead, and
wanted-
then
wanted
I
to
want to
correct
pull it
one
back
thing.
to...
I think you're mentioning that maybe Roger said that the RAN was only 20% of the cost. I wasn't in the room
Yeah, that
all
was
the
on
time
the
this
panel
morning, but
earlier.
that's certainly not what
That was said by
Alexander
your
Brock
senior.
said today. Pardon me?
That was said by your. I'm not sure the gentleman's name, but he was the Rogers wireless.
The 5G pin.
Well, he's sitting right there.
There he is.
There he is. There you go.
Congratulations for misquoting me. What I said is, in a radio network, as in the whole thing, radios make up about 20%. Doesn't mean that you're not spending the rest on all of the other infrastructure in terms of towers, in terms of backhaul, in terms of core, in terms of all the other facilities that come behind the core. So no, sorry, you're wrong.
No, I agree with you. I'm not wrong. I agree with you.
Just to clarify, so the RAN network in total is the majority of the cost. It's over 50%.
Well,
Like Alexander's point is that of that, the radio gear itself is a certain percentage, but obviously actually building the towers, clearing the roads, the power, et cetera,
but that's the point. I'm
But that
agreeing
is,
with you.
the RAN itself is the most important part of the network.
But that's what the
Costly,
definition that got lost with the whole MVNO decision was the RAN. The radio access network does not comply with being a home network. That was the definition. And to that point, as a CLEC, we already have the backhaul. We already have the facilities. Adding a RAN is not the problem. It's all the back-end integration. So I'm actually, like, you guys should probably talk before a session like this, because I'm just stating facts that I heard from the Rogers team.
So the facts are, with great respect, you spent $2.5 million in the 600 megahertz auction. That's 2 rural towers worth of infrastructure. If you want to talk facilities, please come and talk, because frankly, building a network is a hell of a lot more than $2.5 million to build something.
We've built
all of the urban
towers on
markets.
top of mountains with helicopters, trust me. I've been to places that I bet a lot of people in this room haven't been. I'd love to invite you to come up to the north and see some of the stuff that we've done.
TELUS will show you. You'll see it in a slide deck tomorrow.
Great.
I've been to one of Sammer's towers. Rob, did you want to add something?
Just rising above which parts of the network are which and who has an advantage or doesn't. I think there's a serious public policy question here. We're on the cusp of 5G. Prices are coming down. And we have 4 facilities-based carriers in this country, as many as there are in the US, where there's 400 million wireless accounts. There's 33 million here. On the edge of a 5G world, do we really believe that MVNOs are the answer? In a world where we want to roll out 5G to rural communities all over this country, are MVNOs going to be the vehicle by which we accomplish that equally important public policy goal?
Rob,
and I would say no, that's not the answer. The answer is facilities-based competition. We have it, and it's growing. What do you say to Shaw and to Videotron, who have just, on the prospect of becoming facilities-based providers, invested hundreds of millions or billions of dollars in spectrum? They're building out, they're price competing. Consumers are seeing the benefit of it, and all of a sudden we think, oh, we've pivoted so far to, that's not happening fast enough. We need a resale model.
So to your point, I don't have a crystal ball to say MVNOs is the answer, yes or no, but it is a step forward in the right direction, because until we can line the dots and figure out what's going on, it's, like I said, not mandating MVNOs in Canada would be exactly like removing all regulatory requirements from ILECs. What do you think would happen? We would be extinct, including non-Bell probably, because a lot of Bell owns a lot of the country. I mean, let's be real here. So that's where we're at. We are at a point where we don't have a crystal ball. I'm not saying MVNO is the answer, but it's like stir and shake in presentation earlier. Is that going to stop robocalls? No, because if the servers are in China, it doesn't matter, right? I mean, that's, at the end of the day, it's a global problem, but it's a step forward to get things moving. That's all I'm saying.
With respect, though, I think Sammer is mixing examples or something. If the government would step away, or the CRTC would do whatever the CRTC needs to do in terms of its preliminary view, that isn't at all saying anything about the broader wholesale framework that's been around since 1997 and before. It's saying nothing about that. It's saying that MVNOs who do not build networks in certainly the fullest form is not necessary in a market that demonstrates that there is no market failure. And for all of these other market facts that Rob and Dave have illustrated, and as CJ's company is proving every single day. So I don't sort of get that equivalency. What the problem here is, and it will come up, I assume, in some of your other topics. I mean, we have the government, to my point about incoherence, the government seems to have gotten the cart before the horse here. So in 2006, the government had a thing called the Telecom Policy Review Panel that spent a lot of time, and there were a lot of people who made submissions on ways to update the act, and this would have been a good place for this kind of thing that I think you're pitching. I'm not sure, to be honest, I don't completely understand it, but that's just me. But that would be a good place to have that debate, and I don't know if you made that argument around the definition of facilities, to be honest with you, Sammer, and what's transmission facility and what isn't, and that kind of stuff. That I think is a worthy discussion to have. But in 2006, the government let the panel at least come out with its report before it issued a policy direction. Now we have a proposed policy direction in advance of the BTLR. We have apparently, it's like some 10-year-old with ADHD in the policy toolkit room throwing out all these various different models into the public space.
The BTLR panel is due the same month as the beginning of the wireless review.
I'm sorry?
The BTLR panel is the same month as the wireless
we've
review.
been flooded with a series of things that are incoherent, and that is the incoherence. And what is at risk? Like, back to the point, I think Alexander was touching on it, and Dave was touching on it, and Rob was touching on it. In the 2018 CRTC monitoring report, the telcos and the cablecos, 45% of their revenues were invested in capital. The rest of all industries in this country, 6.6%. So if you think that there is something at risk here, that's not just us being truculent and saying no out of hand, that isn't what it is. It's that there's something to lose here, something that's very important in a country of this size, with this population, with the kind of things when Sammer's building facilities up on the top of mountaintops, and he knows from having done that, and as I said, you'll see pictures of this, exactly this kind of thing tomorrow morning. That is what you risk. And as Rob says, when our prime directive should be having policies that support the building out of 5G to the furthest corners of this country we can, this is exactly the thing you do not do as a policymaker. It's exactly the thing. And that is what you will lose, that is what you will threaten. And as Robert Giz said, I thought in his speech earlier, we all can go explain that to Canadians, why they're not getting advanced services because, CJ's investment review team at Xplornet, which will look at these things the exact same way as we do. While rural's out the window on that particular location because it doesn't make sense.
The policy panic, the policies that are being driven by this are because I said CRTC, the Prime Minister's office, every other Canadian I talk to are 100% convinced they pay too much. So we need to bring prices down. And they're also 100% convinced that their telecom providers don't treat them very well. This is what's driving all of this. So you've all got government relations in your titles. How do you convince them otherwise that prices don't have to be rolled back and we don't have to take these steps to increase competition and lower prices?
We should get rid of supply management because I pay too much for the price of milk, but we don't do that either. This almost singular concern, it's like the whole Telecom Act. One day I woke up and it's like, of the 8,000 telecom policy objectives, that each and of which in themselves are incoherent, they are unranked, unprioritized, that somehow a price has suddenly become the sole item that is on people's minds. You say that you hear from every Canadian that you talk to that they pay too much. I could go and ask Canadians, Greg, if, do you pay too much for, name anything.
Yeah, but anything is not their phone. Their phone is everybody's life nowadays. My entire life is in my phone. My kids are in my phone. My mom is in my phone. My fun is in my phone. My work is in my phone.
33 million people have mobile subscriptions in this country. Classic economics would tell you that is not a pricing problem.
So Dave, tell me a little bit about your point of view on prices.
Well, I was going to say, you really have hit the conundrum that policymakers face. And that is that our services have become so important in people's lives that they really must have it. And frankly, they really must have it. They must have high-speed internet to fully function in today's economy and society, which raises a rural and remote problem. The problem is that everybody consumes 30–40% more per year, and unit costs simply are not falling to that extent. So people, they are getting a price decrease per unit of consumption. To think that you could get an absolute price decrease is frankly not realistic for the reasons that I said earlier. There are not supernormal profits in the facilities-based industry. So hopefully, as was discussed today, with coming technology, that there will be further improvements with 5G in terms of the massive consumption and so on and so forth. But it's really only going to be that I think is going to be able to address a problem to the extent that you could maybe stabilize prices, but still have the high-quality network that you want, to be able to extend that network to rural and remote locations, and move into 5G. My background is an economist. 5G, I wonder, on the residential, the consumer side, to your point, people would really like to pay less for what they're getting now. So to what extent are they going to be willing to pay more in terms of revenue going forward? Yet we heard about a $26 billion price tag over the next 7 years, plus spectrum costs on top of that. So I think, well, is all of that money going to be generated from Internet of Things applications, from business applications, through changing production functions? I don't know. That seems to me to be a big ask and sort of an unanswered question on 5G. But not to ramble on, it is a conundrum, but I think people have unrealistic expectations to think that the sticker price can come down and you can still have the same quality of networks, consume 40% more per year, and do the other socially useful things that we want to have done in terms of rural and remote, and go into 5G.
I just wanted to sort of, well, just
go ahead, finish your thought, and then
yeah,
we've got 2 questions in the audience.
Sorry, just to respond to that, I mean, I think the message from consumers has been clear for a long time that prices are too high. Where they do have services, they have lower caps because that's what they can afford, or other limits on their services. In rural and remote areas, disproportionately, they don't even or can't even afford to have services, or in certain communities as well, which we've heard from PIAC. The government now hears that, and that's the message that we're seeing from ISED, from the CRTC, from the Competition Bureau's interest in the area as well. And I hear the incumbents saying that they can't meet those demands because of the way that the system is structured right now. I mean, it comes from the way that that's all incentivized right now. That's the fundamental tension for why this needs to change. Something needs to change here so that we can start to address those issues. And if that means reconfiguring where the competition is for different services, and if that has an impact on the incumbent's ability to offer those services in the market because other people are in that market as well, that is exactly what Canadians are asking for. More choices and lower prices.
But somebody has to incur the cost to provide the fundamental network. And it costs money. And so I guess you could make the argument, I don't think you can make the argument that all of us are inefficient. And so we've gone through the cost argument, and we've talked about the profit margin. I just don't know, you say change the incentives. What do you mean by change the incentives to change the system?
I mean, you're not, so like on you invest to build networks. That's fine. Put that aside because those networks get paid for from the services that are on them. You're not building more networks than get used. That would be inefficient. The networks get used. The prices that people pay, wholesale or retail, are going to compensate you for the networks plus, or for the investments plus profit. That's fine. It's on the services side where right now the incentives are all aligned so that you build a network that you control and prop up prices. You're not competing. What it should be would be that there would be more providers offering more of those services, and you and other facilities-based providers would be competing for our services as well as for your own customers. There would be a bigger competitive market for the services. That's the role of service-based competition. It reaches end users. There would still be facilities-based competition, but it's at that lower level. That's what I meant by realigning the incentives.
Can we break for questions? I don't know who was first, but we'll start here.
Thank you. So it's not a question, it's more of a comment. This is Olivera. So I moved to Canada 25 years ago. And when we moved here, my first rent for a one-bedroom apartment was $691. And my first phone bill was $800. So 1 minute with Eastern Europe was $2.3. So my phone bill was more expensive than a rent. So these days, when our kids move from home to downtown Toronto, they pay $2,000 for one-bedroom apartment, and $60 it's a flat-free fee for unlimited data access. So I just want to say that I know we're all complaining that telecommunication is expensive, but look how far did we get from over the last 25 years. And I'd like to thank you all, guys. I feel more connected now with the rest of my family overseas than ever before. I think we actually made a significant step forward when it comes to price.
Okay, thanks. And I think even as Chairman Scott mentioned yesterday, there's going to be data coming out this month that show prices have fallen 2017 to 2018. So I guess we have that to look forward to later on this month. Robert used the StatsCan data for 2014, I think 2017, but the Vulnerability study showed price reductions. The monitoring report shows price reductions. We offered in the mobile wireless or wholesale wireless review proceeding a study that examined 296 plans and showed 80% of them were below international benchmarks. I mean, but Paul Mackley said this morning, you could get a data plan in Niagara Falls, Ontario, and a data plan in Niagara Falls, New York, and the one in Ontario is 10 times the price on a per gigabyte data or per gigabyte status than in the U.S.
Then, I mean, I don't know where he's getting
so prices
that from.
are still too high is what I'm getting at.
Well, one of the things no one wants to talk about when they talk about prices is the quality of the networks. So the quality of the networks may explain price differential. The other thing that seems to get lost in the debate is it's an expensive business to be in. It's an expensive business to build facilities, as you've heard. And we're also asked to do a lot by the government. And I'll give you a couple of examples. There's a $750 million broadband fund that the CRTC has initiated in order to extend coverage to rural areas. Very laudable public policy goal. We should all be doing our share. That's paid for by the providers. There's an additional $50 million of administration that the CRTC has tacked on to run the fund, even though I said probably could have done it much cheaper, but I'm digressing. So, we have spectrum costs that are amongst the highest in the world. We have to invest and reinvest in our networks every year. That goes to price. And then I look at, well, what are we trying to solve for with this MVNO model that everyone thinks is the shiny new toy that's going to get prices down? If you actually look at what MVNOs, the largest MVNOs in the US charge, look at someone like TracFone or Google Fi. TracFone's out there with a $47 plan for 1 gig of data. Well, we have, Lucky Mobile has $25 for a gig. You look at Google Fi's charging $94 for 5 gigs of data. We have plans ranging from $75 for 13 gigs on a share plan to 8 gigs of data for $50. So the prices are competitive, and we have the benefit of companies that are willing to invest in Canada. So I don't know where we're going with the MVNO model. It looks like prices are coming down, and you have companies providing those services at lower prices that are investing in infrastructure. That sounds to me like it's good for Canada.
Wait, Samer's going to look a shock on his face.
I mean, let's just agree that, like, we agree on the facilities-based model, but how do you get facilities-based in a wireless market when spectrum is gone, scarce asset? How can you get that? So are we going to wait 20 more years until 500 megahertz gets released? Or like, so, okay, great, we're all for facilities-based. How do you get spectrum in a world that has no spectrum? It's not like laying another fiber and, you know, putting another backhaul network. It's not. This is spectrum that once it's gone, it's gone.
Right.
And because you guys had a head start for some companies, you know, 40 years, 20 years, whatever it might be, how do you fix that? So let's talk facilities. Okay.
I don't know if you look
you should ask ICIT about the speed and timing of their spectrum auctions. There's more spectrum. I get it, theoretically.
But it's high frequency. All the low ones
but
are
you just
gone.
bought 600.
Yeah, but okay.
I thought you bought low band.
We did, but the problem is it's a nationwide.
You can
Hang on a second, I got a
subordinate.
strong view on spectrum, because that is indeed one of the barriers I was speaking about to getting into this business. When we first started out, we went to ICED and said there isn't spectrum for broadband in rural. We need spectrum. They looked at us and said, go buy it in the marketplace, which was an exceptionally difficult thing to do.
It's impossible.
Needless to say, the big three here were not exactly in a selling mood when we started out. We gradually built up our portfolio. It took us a long time to get to where we are. To be faced now with the 3500 situation, where the one and only spectrum we could buy competitively and in the marketplace that we paid for, and yet here we are facing people lobbying to have it removed from us. How does that facilitate competition in the marketplace? So that is the one point I very much agree. The spectrum policies are definitely broken when you do invest in the facilities, you do try to build your networks, and have the rug pulled out from under you.
Everything else is regulated and mandated except the only thing that is a scarce asset, which doesn't make sense. So at least either remove all mandated access and just let the incumbents strive, or mandate the only one thing that is actually a scarce asset that you cannot rebuild or you cannot get.
We've had someone very patiently standing in the mic at the back. I can't see who it is, but.
Hi, Greg. Thank you. Algis Saxnas, CEO of .mobile. Thank you, panelists. If I can offer my comment and then a few questions. You had a lot of discussions about return on investments. Last year, we saw the details of cost from each carrier, and there is a set intra-carrier rate between operators. So Bell, Rogers, TELUS, Shaw, anyone with facilities can buy from each other at $13 to $14 a gigabyte. If we talk about this number, is this a sufficient return on investment, and it has a baked-in 40% margin on your investments that were already made into 99% population coverage of LTE Advanced, and not talking about 5G. Also, a comment about facilities, competitors, facilities investments. We know that Shaw deployed its spectrum that they won into. They started deploying into 2009 on absolutely last month of 10 years license. So we see this facilities-based investments basically are kind of running out of steam. And the question is, I think, question is not about what you can buy for $120 or $30. Question is what you can buy for $30. Yes, what kind of service you're able to buy for that. And then when we talk about that, question is if it leaves the network at $14 with a 40% margin, that is national roaming, why don't we have a $14 a gigabyte plan? And are there any business models in MVNOs, digital ones, using eSIM, so on and so forth, that would be able to generate enough value for MNOs and also offer an affordable service for more than half of Canadian population that currently are not buying advanced services and iPhones. I personally believe that the service is really good at $130, and it won't get cheaper. It probably should get even more expensive because the phones are getting expensive and so on and so forth. But how do we address the bottom of the market is what's driving regulatory, in my opinion, and this is where MVNOs can offer differentiated business models and generate enough value back to MNOs. Thank you.
Algus, before you leave the microphone, can I just ask you a question? You've referenced that 50% of Canadians are on 2G or 3G plans previously.
2 gigabytes plans or less.
Oh, that's what you meant,
Yeah,
2 gigabyte, 3
that's,
gigabyte.
December CRTC data.
Okay, that's what you were referring to.
Yeah.
Okay, I got it.
Dave, you had an answer too.
Well, I was going to start with some of the questions there on the, is a roaming rate an appropriate rate for an MVNO rate? The answer to that is no. Roaming costs are just a subset of the costs. But very importantly, you referred to a 40% margin being included in that rate. That's not correct. So the way the cost studies are done, you go and you model out the network, you identify all the costs, individually identifiable costs. The 40% markup is to cover those costs, variable common costs that you can't identify separately, and fixed and common costs. It's not a return on the investment. The return on the investment, we're all allowed in that rate, it varies. I think you're allowed 11.5% after-tax return on equity. That is built into the rate. It's an 11, you are allowed to recover your debt cost plus an 11.5% after-tax return on the equity component of your capital structure. The 40% has nothing to do with profit. That 40% is to recover costs. They're not individually separable. So that's a very important point to make. The other point I would make is, on pricing, I think addresses the issue generally, top end to bottom end. The people in the market today, we have an enormous variety of plans under different brands that run from very high capacity down to $15 plans. There is a wide range. There really is nobody in this country who couldn't afford a $15 plan. Now, they may not like their $15 plan because they really want the attributes of a much more expensive plan, but that is certainly available to them. And I can't remember the other points I was going to address, so I'm going to turn it over.
Anybody else want to address Algus?
Thank you.
All right, thanks. Just to keep on beating the MVNO horse a little bit more, I had an idea to, I'm talking to the big three here. You all have customers that you are not particularly fans of, that don't pay their bill, they churn in and out. They're late paying their bill. What would be the harm, or could you see a profit to letting MVNOs have those customers? It's like, look, we don't want them anyway, so you guys have them and see if you can make money off it, because we don't really want to bother with them anymore.
I've never heard anybody in TELUS say, I don't want a customer. I've never heard that. That's a revelation to me.
I've heard some of your CEOs in their conference calls say they would like to concentrate on the higher value customers, which means there are higher value and lower value customers. So you let some of those lower value customers go.
It doesn't mean you value them less.
Well,
it means that they are taking less services.
True. But those are the words being used.
Things here.
I may be conflating things, but so let's say, Samer, you bring sugar back back to prominence. Does that customer base appeal to you? Do you want to go after those particular folks?
We would love any customer. I mean, our model is a data on demand and a prepaid model, so we have no exposure to somebody not paying and it's I agree with Algus. Like, there is a segment in the market that does not get what they want. There's a void. There's a void, and I think MVNOs could fill that void.
Okay. Are there any other questions out there? Yeah. Oh, I see someone standing up over there. Shoot.
So Ian Fogg from Open Signal. So I have an observation, which is if you look around the world over the last few years, there's actually been kind of a wave of consolidation of infrastructure owning operators. In the main because we're approaching an era where there is a need to invest more in the network, to deploy new spectrum, to deploy 5G, to deploy new core networks and move in that direction. It seems to me, as one of the speakers said earlier, this conversation feels like it's a bit out of time. It's not where the world is at the moment, it's where the world used to be. When I look forward and I look around some of the signature carriers around the world, I think mentioned yesterday morning Rakuten in Japan, which is pulled up as one of the most innovative operators with the way they're structuring their network, and they're looking at new ways of building the telecom infrastructure. They are in the process, as we speak, of migrating from being an MVNO to moving into facilities-based competition in Japan with a spectrum license. So it seems to me that this is a very odd conversation when I look at what's happening around the world.
I couldn't agree more, actually. It feels like we're like in a time machine here, went back in time, absolutely. And we keep talking about the same topics for many years before we get any resolution, so.
One of my comment would be, because I think the gentleman was referring to my comment about this is like a 1990s remedy looking for a solution. If I understand you correctly, sir, there is a move to consolidate amongst infrastructure providers in Europe and all over the place. And that you see regulators, as a former regulator, you see regulators suddenly, and competition authorities suddenly, particularly in Europe, suddenly looking at types of arrangements in the marketplace that they never would have considered before. And that's because they're worried about investment. And that's why they in that experiment that I think the gentleman was referring to, what they saw over time was, in regulators speak, was hyper competition. It was almost irrational competition, to the point where companies who had formerly built facilities were tailing off their infrastructure investments, and regulators, right-thinking regulators, should be very concerned about that. It's a very fine balance. I'm not saying there isn't a role for wholesale. I'm not. And I'm not saying that there isn't a role in a commercially negotiated agreement, but I am saying that if you mandate and use 1990s ideas today, you will not have 5G, and you will not continue to have the world-leading networks that we have in this country, which frankly is a marvel in a country this size.
And how would you... Sorry, if you look at, just to build on Ted's point, you look at a place like Israel. Israel decided at a point in time that after introducing 3 facilities-based players, that prices were still too high, and they took drastic measures to mandate MVNOs. And the outcome, which is what they're trying to reverse now, was, I think, network quality went from being 4th in the OECD to being 29th. The wireless industry saw a workforce reduction of 35%. Obviously, profits and capital spending declined. And now, you're reading stories about how Israel's trying to turn that around, because their system has now become a bit of an unmitigated disaster in terms of their wireless networks. So when we talk about old ideas, there have been cases where MVNOs have been introduced and they haven't produced the outcomes that I think the government is trying to produce, which is next generation networks, 5G, and ubiquitous rural coverage.
But there are people in power as well as consumer groups who just say, we don't believe you. The opportunities for you guys to invest in your networks are too great. You're going to continue to invest. The threats that you're going to pull back in investment, we don't buy it. You've heard these arguments?
Yeah, I've heard that. I've heard people
What do
say
you
that.
say to them?
Well, actually, I think Andy was going to say something, so.
Oh, I was just going to add maybe a dimension to this, which is that 5G actually makes this all the more important to introduce competition on mobile. It doesn't, you know, when the dream of 5G and this sort of unified network kind of service that blends from home to mobile and sort of the vision that we see portrayed is only going to work when your provider can transfer that traffic seamlessly. And if we're going to be able to continue to compete on the wireline side, we are more and more going to need to also be able to compete on the mobile side. And we don't have to wait to 5G to get there either. Your mobile phone is like the anchor of your communications services now. It's the one thing that we probably all have with us, like on stage right now. It's the one thing you will bring into the washroom with you. It's an extension of your arm. And to be excluded from that market altogether makes it harder and harder to compete in other markets as well. So just another dimension or a twist maybe on the idea that 5G makes it actually less necessary to have competition. I think the introduction of 5G makes it more necessary to be able to compete on mobile.
But who's going to build 5G? Is it the resellers that are suddenly going to have an
No,
epiphany?
we're not disagreeing about the facilities.
Someone has to build it.
Yes. Facilities, people in a position to build facilities will build facilities where they're in a position to do that. And you will do that because it's the business that you're in and there is a need for those facilities. You'll do that and we'll buy the services.
I don't, see, my problem is that, I don't agree. I agree that it's a problem that people perceive this as some sort of idle threat, because I can tell you when you go in to an investor review team meeting and these things are stacked up, you have a limited bucket of resources as large as that bucket may sound like it is. You have all of these projects set up in priorities with return on equity and return on investment associated with those. And invariably, it's a struggle for one type of class of investment that people are struggling with. And it's around the fringe of the network. And it's just as simple as that. And so I'm not, Dave is a financial guy. He understands that stuff way better than I do. But to me, it's simple arithmetic where something has a lower return on investment and where it has all kinds of other intangible issues with deploying facilities out beyond the fringe of your network. What's first to go? That's first to go. And the more pressure you squeeze on that, the more of those cases there will be. And that is the existential question.
Well, there's two things going on here. There's the question of investment and the return on the investment. And there is the natural notion that we're all sort of talking about, which is the assumption about what kind of return we can get from an MVNO. Because of exactly what Greg had highlighted, the price issue, the consumer's perception of value, that we're not providing sufficient value. And therefore, the question would be, in order to allow MVNO reseller types to come in, you'd have to push down the amount that the facilities-based providers would be able to charge to a point where it doesn't make any economic sense. So the problem is we're trying to play with the markets here. We're not sure which problem we're trying to solve. Do we want the innovation? Do we want the lower price? And we're trying to manage the market. I don't have a crystal ball on how to fix that, but I think that's what we're all talking about, and each showing that there are indeed at least 6 different opinions here on how we go about doing that.
And we seem to be stuck on the price, though, from the government point of view. That seems to be the #1 overarching concern, period.
And can I just take another crack at that from a completely left field? I'll tell you, Greg, because you sit sort of atop the media, you know, you're there with the other media folks who look at this and are interested in this industry, and thank you very much for being interested in it. But like literally, there are a battalion of facts out there that demonstrate very clearly the kinds of things that various people have been talking about. Where I find it very interesting, and it becomes almost some sort of sentient thing, is this perception that you have articulated, and Samar and Andy have as well, in fairness, that prices are too high and there isn't enough competition. I think the industry has failed to some degree because either we're not particularly good or are learning how to fight back on a policy and regulatory front through social media. There are people who have very loud voices on those particular media who are propagating things that are frankly untruths and are factually incorrect. And they are heard in places where unbelievably people actually listen to them. When there are, you know, records with reams and reams of evidence that clearly shows that this is a high-performing industry with high-quality networks, with prices that are about average. There's government data to that effect. There's StatsCan data to that effect. There's private expert reports to that effect. This fellow, excuse me if I get his name wrong, Yossi Abadi, that Rob mentioned, I stumbled upon that in the Bell submission and read it. Fascinating. I commend it to you. Please read it from a regulator in Israel. That is the problem. People have perceptions that are not anchored in any kind of fact or evidence-based data. And for public policymakers, when you do things that are based on perception and some sort of emotional sense, or in a retail political sense, when you're searching around for something to grab onto, and you're dealing in an infrastructure industry that is absolutely critical to the economy of this country going forward, you're in dangerous territory, and that's why I say these policies are incoherent.
But it boils down to whose experts are we going to believe? Because I've read Sammer's and
I don't know,
Andy's
Stats Canada.
I've read Sammer's and Andy's experts and PX experts and all of your experts, and there's so many different points of view about who's right and which direction we should go that it becomes bewildering.
I don't know, pick one. Like, is StatsCan wrong? Do they have skin in the game here somehow?
What I fail to understand is how is this seen as a threat, though? Like, so once again, I'm sitting on both sides of the table, right? So I'm an MNO, and we've gone through this before in terms of wireline service, the deregulation, and that's why the rent, you know, back in the day, a long-distance phone call used to be $4. Actually, calling Montreal, I think, was like $2 a minute, and now it's not. But revenues for Iristel didn't diminish. We've actually used our wholesale network to help us get more volume. We're more profitable than ever since we, you know, first started and the whole VoIP gig was new. This is not new to us. I fail to understand the threat level that the MNOs are talking about, me as an MNO. Now, as an MVNO, sure, yes, an MNO will lose some margin, but you'll make it up on numbers. There's a void in the marketplace here. You only have 33 million subscribers. You know what? Why can't we have 60 million subscribers? There's nothing wrong with that. Yes, there's only 35 million people here, but guess what? People might have two phones, one for their work, one for their home, whatever it might be. Dual SIM cards, whatever it might be. There's so much at stake here for not, let's call it an experiment. Let's try the experiment out. There's nothing to lose, you know? And I just fail to understand the threat from the MNOC.
But there's a great deal to lose. That's the problem. And when you say what you said at the outset there, Sammer, I was there for the long distance stuff, as was Dave. and a lot of other people in this room. Actually, I've heard ideas about sunsetted obligations. The CRTC is once again, or somebody's mooted, once again, some kind of sunset nonsense. There never is a sunset, ever. Once you go down that path, you will be on that path forever. So none of these ideas that you're talking about, I've heard them all before. And they, they've failed before, or they've had marginal results before. They've created very little innovation or disruption or anything else. Where that actually happens, and what there is evidence to show, is that happens through facilities-based competition and people competing to make their networks faster, better, and Canada stands at the top of the class in that.
Rob, did you want to add to on what Samer said about there being no harm to experiment to get as many business models as we can into the market?
Well, I think there is potentially great harm to this experiment, and it's easy if you're the person, and I know you're investing in network somewhere, but it's easy if you're the person who's not investing in the network to say, let's take a flyer, let's let people onto the network at low cost-based rates, and let's see what happens. Well, we saw what happened in Israel. So, we've seen the experiment, and it didn't work very well. And I don't know at what point Canada doesn't start celebrating what it's accomplished in terms of networks. As I said, 37 million people, 4 facilities-based providers, networks that are ranked number 1 or 2 in the world, terrific network consistency compared to the US, ubiquity in terms of coverage. We've accomplished all those things somehow in a facilities-based model. And at some point, we should stand up and say, this is working. So let's carry it forward to 5G, replicate it again, and move forward instead of experimenting over some perceived problem that prices are so far beyond the Rubicon that Canadians are suffering.
But I would love to agree with Rob, but I just can't, because the country of our size, we've only covered the border with the US in the NFL cities, or the NHL cities here, whatever you want to call it. The rest, you drive 2 hours north of Toronto, you don't have coverage. So I'm not sure what we're bragging about. We should not be bragging about this. This is actually a walk of shame, not a walk of fame. Because you look at other countries, finally, we're just starting to get the national broadband strategy. Finally, we're starting to do that. With the billions of dollars the industry here has, and that's at stake, this country should have been developed 10 times over already.
And who's funding that national broadband strategy? It's facilities-based providers.
Not just facilities-based, it's taxpayers.
Private investors, thank you.
It's taxpayers.
Because 2 hours north is Xplornet country, and we're delighted to serve that part of the country. We're very proud to have built out the non-urban areas of this country.
And they do that through leasing satellite capacity and building their own network capacity through fixed wireless access, and they've done a hell of a job at it. But one of the things that I would like to say, just in response to that, when you use that example of drive 2 hours north of Toronto and there's no cell phone coverage, which is ostensibly probably not true, but the fact is that I have learned one thing in my career, and that where there are no people, there are no services. It's a hard business case.
Actually, that's not technically
when there's nobody there to buy your service. But I'm sorry for your experience in Ontario, but I do invite you to come to Alberta, where it's quite actually impressive, the amount of geography that we've covered. So please come out.
I do have to back Samer up. My cell phone service does drop out when I drive through Hopeville on my way to the ski hill in the winter. Hopeville is within 2 hours drive of here. So I got to back them up. Now, there's no Xplornet cell service there, but
No, but we do have fixed wireless there.
Exactly.
Get it back once you come out of the
Uh-oh, we're getting the bums rush.
You know, and there is this one hole on the DVP every time I drive down that one dip that the call drops, or at least that's what I say to my wife. Sorry, I would never hang up on you, dear. But, Michael?
Wasn't that great? Please, a big round of applause for Greg and the panelists. CJ, Dave, Andy, Ted, Samer, Rob, thank you very much for being here. And, you know, Ted mentioned incoherence of maybe of policy and of regulatory, but certainly not any incoherence amongst the panelists and your views, and we thank you for being here. I think there are about, I don't know, over a dozen points that, major topics that the panel was to discuss, and they narrowed it down to half a dozen. I think maybe they talked about 2.